I'd like to welcome you to the March meeting of the Ontario Genealogical Society, Essex branch. We think we have an excellent presentation for you tonight, a couple of presentations actually tonight. We should indicate to you, as you may have seen on the way in, that we are trying something a little bit different tonight. We have about 100 and some members of the Essex branch of the society. We have about 30 who actually live in the Windsor area, 30 to 40. So there are a lot of members that we do not reach, and certainly as you're well aware, technology is playing a bigger and bigger part in a lot of meetings and things of that nature. So we've decided to try a bit of an experiment tonight with the hope of learning some things about it. This particular meeting will be videotaped. So we're hoping that once the videotape is complete, that we will be able to post the actual videotape on the members-only website of the Essex branch, so that people in California, Calgary, who are members of this branch, who have connections to the Essex County area, will be able to not participate, but at least see the meeting, hear the speakers, hear the presentations, and hopefully that will be of interest to them. And hopefully eventually we would like to be able to live stream meetings on the internet to the people who are interested, but that's down the road. So we decided at our last council meeting that we would be taking this experiment, see how it works, learn from it, and then proceed to try and provide for all members information about the branch and what's going on here. So, as I say, the session will be in fact videotaped for that purpose. We would like to just indicate a couple of things. First of all, it's coming up to conference time for the Ontario Genealogical Society. And if you're just getting into this particular area of interest, you may find the conference invaluable because there's a lot of different speakers. It's over several days, a lot of different tours where you can get information that might help you in the research of your family history. Pat, could you just tell us a little bit about the conference itself?
Thank you, Jim. As Jim mentioned, the annual OGS conference is coming up. It's going to be May 1st to 4th in St. Catharines at Brock University. As Jim mentioned, it's a great opportunity for people that are just getting out, getting experience, learning about research, as well as people that have got a few more years under their belt. The Thursday, Friday are tours, half-day, full-day tours of different historical areas, historical spots around the area. Friday there are half-day workshops, a number of different topics are covered. Saturday, Sunday are various speakers throughout the day, and then the business meeting also fits in there somewhere. There's a big banquet on Saturday night, I believe. So it's a great opportunity to get some education on research, to meet other people that are doing research. Sometimes people connect with distant cousins that they didn't know they had. And there's a trade show area as well, lots of vendors, so you can pick up books and all kinds of interesting stuff. So if you go to, just Google OGS Conference 2014, you can register online or you can print out and mail in a registration form. There is accommodation blocks of rooms at the two colleges one's at Niagara Falls and I think the other's at Niagara on the Lake, and there's a shuttle running from one of those conferences to Brock. Anyway, if you're at all interested, check out the site, and hope to see you there. I think there's about 3 or 4 people from this branch that we know of right now that are going. Okay.
Thanks, Pat. On that same note then, as I said, I welcome everybody here tonight. Is there anybody who is coming for the first time tonight? Anybody? Okay. And what I'd like to know is, do you have a particular family that you're researching or interested in?
Her family was
Okay, very good. So he's going to be to provide assistance there. Who else? There's one back here. And what family are you researching?
Well, my family is fully researched because Nick has done all the research. She took us back to the 1600s. I figured that was as good as we could have.
That's about it, eh? Thank you. And one back here.
We're not researching, we just saw it in the paper. It's very
Well, there you go.
interesting topic.
We want to get you started in researching. Hopefully you'll find the ideas interesting in that sense. Okay. One of the other things that we have been doing as a branch, certainly family research, family history research is a major part, certainly, of genealogy. But one of the things that we have decided as a branch is that the context of what you look up is very important. The context in which, in the times that people lived, help to inform what might otherwise be relatively dull statistical information about families. So we endeavor at some of our meetings of the branch to provide opportunities to enhance the context in which you might be doing some research and investigating. And tonight is no exception. The other thing that we have tried to do this spring particularly is to inform our members of the other resources available within the Essex County area. Depending upon where your ancestors lived or grew up, you might find that those particular sites are very specific to the area that you're interested in. For example, earlier this year we had a presentation, very brief presentation, an overview of what's available at the Family History Center out in Forest Lake. Tonight, we're going to continue that trend, and we're going to feature brief information from HEIRS, the Harrow Early Immigrant Research Society, out in Harrow, which has a wonderful facility there. And we're going to give you a quick overview of what's available there, should you find that area significant in the work that you're doing or in your interests. So we have two gentlemen here this evening, sometime, to give some information about HEIRS. And well, I'd like to welcome Ted Steele and Richard Herman from HEIRS to give us a brief overview of their facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. MacKendrick. I am the president of HEIRS. For any of you who are not familiar with the group, and I've seen some different faces here who are very familiar with our group. It was started 43 years ago, and we're a nonprofit and we are a charitable organization, so anyone who does make a donation to our group, we can give them a receipt if they want to claim it. As Mr. MacKendrick mentioned, our resource center is located in Harrow. It is in the community arena. It is fully handicap accessible. Everything is on one floor. Our membership, we had, I think Ted and I are aware of some of the new ones. We had, in the last 4 or 5 years, we had 4 new members out of 9 come on board. And we've kind of cleaned house a little bit. They were sending emails and letters and letters and letters and newsletters. We were down to 125 people in 2012. We're now over 180. And when we talk to the other groups, we're considered one of the biggest historical groups in Essex and Kent County with our membership. And we have a very, very active membership.
The name Harrow is in our name, but people sometimes think that we're just Harrow history and genealogy.
Yeah.
No. The whole of Essex County and all the families who've been here for a couple of hundred years, including the French originals, the Loyalists, and all the others. We have massive amounts of information on most of these families.
We do have a board of 9 directors. I did a little bit of checking out in the last week or so after we were invited here. 5 of our directors are UAL. Ted is a UAL. I am a UAL. I go through 5 different families to get my UAL papers. The original one I go through is on the McLeans, and they were originally in Maryland in the 1750s. And I also go through the McCormicks, the Snyders, and a few others, like a lot of people here tonight. In our resource center, we went through our files and we have over 1,500 family names. That's just a family name. There could be 10 brothers and sisters in that family. But that's, if you take the McCormicks, there could be 6 McCormicks that you can go in and get all the genealogy. There's something like 300 to 400 family genealogy records already done. We have over 1,300 books in our library now, over 300 and some in the lending library. And I'm trying to get, we have 4 4-drawer filing cabinets full of land records that go back to the early 1700s.
And they've been digitized,
Yes.
they're into our computer files now, and they're quite accessible.
Like Ted said, we go on the computer, we can pull that up for you if you want to see the original paper, it is in the filing cabinet. At the present time, we do have a working agreement with the University of Guelph. There's a professor at the university, and in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had, I think, 4 students, I get it out of it, down doing their thesis. One was on agriculture, one was on tobacco, that sort of thing. We've also have contacts with Windsor University, Western, and University of Toronto. And we get, every once in a while, we get an email from somebody down there wanting information on such things. The article in this month's newsletter, and Tim brought a few of them in, and this was interesting because if anyone is familiar with Elizabeth and Alexander and Elizabeth McCormick, originally it was Turner. And we've been doing a little article every month in our newsletter about different families. And I put it in this month under the name of Chestnut Burr because that was the Indian name. Knowing that if people saw Elizabeth McCormick, they probably wouldn't be too interested in reading it. But anyways, Chestnut Burr got a lot of interest. And just to give you an idea, one is Cindy Robichaud was here tonight. She sent me an email from Chatham. She said, "Oh, I'm related. Let's get together and find out all the information." The ones I've received 2 today, one from a lady in London, and she has 100 and some pages of McCormick family, which are originally related back to Alexander, from McCormicks who live in the London area, which she was sending to the HEIRS office, of course. The other one I got, which totally surprised me this afternoon, is Williamsburg, Virginia. And the lady down there is doing research, and she's through the Cornwall family, which goes back to the original Alexander McCormick. And she's willing to share information. And that's basically what we've got. Though anybody who's been out there and wants information, if we can't find it, it's going to be hard to get. Yeah, I thank you for having us here tonight. And I think Ted's going to follow up and give you some information on the newsletter and different things we've got going on.
Just a little bit of what we have to offer. We have, as we said, massive amounts of information. There are file folders on these families, and they've been filled with documents that other people have acquired and shared with us. We make a copy and give them back their originals. Reference books. We have access to Ancestry.com. As you know, that's a paying site. Members can come in and use our computer and get onto Ancestry, find out all kinds of things. We have a microfilm reader and the newspaper files that go back, in some cases, at least to 1850. The Amherstburg Echo goes back to about that time. There's the Leamington paper, the Kingsville paper, Harrow, the Windsor Star, and there's one before the Windsor Star, the Board or something. We have that one. They're all available to use in the microfilm reader. And of course, if you find something interesting there, you can print it out. We have 8 meetings a year. We don't meet through the summer. We don't meet in December. In the afternoon on the 4th Thursday of each month. And for those months where we have a meeting, we put out the newsletter. 10 pages. If you get it by email, of course, it's in glorious color. If you get them mailed out to you, that costs us money to do, so we print them in black on white. So, each month it features our topic. We have the Chief of the Colville Indians this month. Louise Hillier will be speaking to us on the 20th, I think it's the 27th. So that should be very educational. Last month, for Black History Month, we had Elise Harding Davis. I'm sure most of you know her, or at least know of her. She's a Black historian, and she lives in the Harrow area, so she's a good friend of yours. We try to get people to realize how interconnected the families are. It is really incredible to find out that your line connects with something you had no idea they connected with. I have roots in Niagara Falls. Well, I should say the Niagara area, loyalist there. And my wife's family, the Loyalists from Essex County. Well, we found out, my mother-in-law here found out, we have the same, I believe it's the 4th or the 6th great-grandfather, back about 1825. And we had no idea of that. And there are various crossovers. I happen to live in Kingsville, where there was a druggist there named James Doan, who invented Doan's kidney pills. He's kin of mine. I had no knowledge of that. You find these things out when you start doing a little exploring. I have 2 cousins who play in the NHL. My wife doesn't believe it, but it's true. And one of my cousins was hung in the rebellion of 1837 as a traitor. You find out some good guys and bad guys. Wonderful stuff. So we have a good time making history interesting. And people come in and find out all sorts of little things they didn't know. We hope to be working with the Harrow High School
Yes.
on a great World War I unit. Teachers contacted us, the principal. And we want to make that personal to the kids and show the local families who were in that. Some of the ones who didn't come home and the ones who did. And the ones they may be related to and have never heard of. So that's the sort of thing we'd like to do, is to open a story that needs to be told and hasn't been shared yet. And HEIRS is a very good group to
Yes.
do that with. As you can see, we're a nice low-key and formal group, and that's the way we'd like to have it.
We don't get too serious at our meetings. And going off, just make it real quick, what Ted was mentioning about the high school group. We were approached by the high school because it's the 100th anniversary of the war, 1914, the First World War this year. And of course, the government's putting a lot of money out and everything else. And the town of Harrow has never had a cenotaph, so the Legion wants to have a cenotaph built in the new Parkhead area. There's 9 members on the plaque from the First World War who died overseas. And when I went in and talked to them, and my dad was in the Second World War, like a lot of other people anyways, they had no record on them other than the names. We have now gone through and we have all the records, when they enlisted, where they enlisted, who they served, where they were killed, where they were buried, on 8 of them. The 9th one we haven't been able to find yet. They had no record of anybody, and we're over 75 names now that we found in the HEIRS file of men from Harrow, Colchester who went overseas. And we've been approached by 2 or 3 other legions. I think Ted will tell you about going up and helping them. The problem is if you go to some of the other places and they don't have the records we have, one of them was Kingsville, like if they don't have those records, we can't. We can show them what we did and how we did it. But if you don't have those original records, you're not going to find those names. And it's very, very hard because in actuality, when you go on the websites, if the guys came back after the war, you can find their when they went in, but you can't find any information after that for them, other than what's called attestation papers, which is when they were either drafted or enlisted. So it gets a little bit confusing, and we all know, anyway, Mr. Tabby's asked us to take 10 or 15 minutes. I think we're over our time limit, so I want to thank you for having us here tonight. And thank you all for the welcome we got. If anybody wants to come to Harrow and take part in any of our meetings, you're more than welcome. We'll have summer students this summer, usually for about 8 weeks, usually there from 9 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. She's been there for 3 or 4 years, so she can pretty well give you any information that you're looking for.
The ladies are there on Tuesdays. They are the secretary. They know what there is and where it's hidden.
Yeah, they
They're
can
very
find.
good at that. And we're usually open Wednesday mornings as well with a volunteer who comes in. And Thursdays, I'm there, and Richard's usually in and out, and the ladies are often in. So there's always somebody there on Tuesday and Thursdays. You can count on that. And we invite you to come up and see what we have. And if we don't have information on your family, you would be somewhat surprised.
Yes.
The files are so massive, but it's a fun place to visit.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're sticking around, aren't you?
Oh, yes.
Good, so if
Your
anybody,
topic's too good to leave.
if anybody is interested in asking Richard or Ted questions at the end of the session, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much for coming. The other point that I did mention initially was that context. We like to provide some context to your research. And I think we've got a most interesting and unusual topic tonight. And our presenter is Catherine MacKendrick. And I first encountered Catherine in an elder college course with the same title as our presentation tonight, the Victorian Celebration of Death, which sort of fascinated me. So I took it, and I will tell you She has a lot of great information, great presenter, and I think it provides, when we're talking about the Victorian era, what life was like at that time. So when you were doing your research, this will help fill in the gaps, if you wish, in terms of society at the time, norms at the time, and what people, how they approached the topic of death in a celebratory way. So, Catherine MacKendrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. If I need the mic, I'll use it, but I think I'll probably be all right. If you can't hear me, because my voice will drop, just wave and I'll try to raise. Are you worried about?
No, I'm just checking it through. We're still plugged in.
It's on. I was thinking you talked about Victorian times, and we think about Victoria, which is 1837 up to the turn of the 20th century, but I'm looking at the whole of the 19th century. And what was unusual about what was happening in the history of the time of Victorian was that, first of all, it was a time of leisure. The 99 years where Europe, and I'm talking about European, basically what didn't have a lot of war going on. Not really. There were small ones, but after 1814, except for way off in Crimea, which we're hearing a lot about the British involvement in Crimea in the 1850s, and the American Civil War, it was a peaceful time. And it was a time of prosperity, and it was the time when the middle class was beginning to grow. So there was more money, and there was more time. And what we do know is that the women particularly are the ones that carried on the mourning, M-O-U-R-I-N-I-N-G, the mourning rituals in that period of time. Perfect. That's I wondered. I was wondering if we'd be able to see the pictures. We think in terms of the mourning rituals and the time of Queen Victoria as being centered around her. The picture on the right-hand side, that's the wedding picture. And I didn't bring my pointer tonight. I knew I'd forget something. So Victoria is the woman in the full mourning. But the bride and groom are on the rear at the left. But we all know who's in the center. And that's Albert. And he's dead. But she grieved for him for the rest of her life, from the time of his death. And because everyone wanted to be like the upper class, I mean, we're no different. It's just really interesting how Victoria's response to her husband's death happened. But it also was a time where families were becoming increasingly important as family units. People were beginning to marry for emotional reasons and not for economic reasons. In other words, marry to get more land or to get a position. So that they became very centered on family. And of course, following Victoria and Albert, where family was the big thing. And that's when the stories would begin. I'm very interested to hear about your UEL connections. I'm also UEL from the Niagara region, Stony Creek. And so, but nice stories I got from my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1874, and my grandfather on my mother's side, 1865. So they grew up in London, Bothwell area, Glencoe area, and lived in London. But they grew up with that whole tradition of Victorian customs. And towards the end of Victorian times, where in our part of the world, the farms were pretty established by that point. And the farms were a fairly decent size. people had leisure time. I remember my grandmother being absolutely horrified at the young woman who lived next door to us, be younger than me, but when she got engaged, she went to her fiance's farm and helped muck out the barn. They had cattle. She was absolutely horrified that this beautiful, educated young woman would have to shift the ship, basically. And, you know, young women did not do that. And my grandmother's little diary that she had of her daily things, weather was bad, couldn't go for tea, because they visited from farm to farm. And even as she was an elderly woman, she lived with us until she was 88 and I was a kid, and she would change her clothes for the evening. She had a house dress in the morning, and then in the afternoon she would change her clothes. There were all these kinds of traditions, and she was a farm girl. So there was still that following the aristocracy. So if death was pictured as intrinsic part of nature, we talk about the philosophers and the poetry, and nature is a huge theme through that time. This is a picture from Maitland Cemetery in Goderich, Ontario, where I grew up. And if you go to any of the big older cemeteries, big ones, usually attached to what used to be outskirts of cities, you will find some of these monuments that talk about, show pictures of nature. Some of them will even include the spiritual aspect of the people. So here we have two logs, and they are entwined with grapes and ivy. But death was it was normal, it was natural, it didn't come in and get you like they used to think before those times. Some of them I find absolutely fascinating. I think the one on the right comes from, it'll come, out in the county. There's a little Anglican church, Cotton, I believe that's from Cotton. One in the middle is from Colorado, and you'll notice that there's a scroll, and that shows the biography of the person who died, because we still want to remember their names, so their names will be there. Sometimes how long they've lived, months, years, months, and days. Very precise. This one on the left, if you get over to this big cemetery in Detroit, I've never seen one like that before. It's a huge stone on a stump, and the biography of the person is engraved on the stone. But death, since our earliest times, has been seen as a form of sleep. We use rest in peace, right? R.I.P. Comes from our Judeo aspect of our background from Judaism, where they felt that the dead went to this place of sleep. So the tradition is 6,000 years in our Judeo-Christian tradition. But what the Victorians did was that they used their monuments to display that. So here we have an angel on the right in Highgate Cemetery in London, upper right. And then in a church in England, a couple of children. We have to remember that in Victorian times, if you go into a cemetery, there are more children's burials than adults, because there wasn't any antibiotics available to the general public until after the Second World War. So diphtheria would run through a family, and scarlet fever, and all kinds of other things. And then we have a child. So here, 3 of those pictures are centered around, monuments are centered around children. Talking about sleep, This is what we call a bedstead tomb, burial spot in Iffley in Essex, England. And it has a headboard and a footboard, like a bed. And on the headboard, at the bottom, there's the picture of the, did you say you had a mouse?
Yes, I do.
If I put my mouse into this, I can make it a pointer. The biography is in the bottom under the angel. The angel at the top is holding the hand of the person who has died and is going up to heaven by pointing a finger. At the very bottom on the footboard is just a little cherub.
Unfortunately,
It ran away. The
I
cat
was at
got
another
it.
presentation day and I got my stuff all in different bags.
I'm
so
sure
thank
the
you.
cat got it.
Sorry about
Never
that.
mind. It wouldn't have been one of my cats. And from Charleston, South Carolina, I found this one fascinating because it's a cradle, but there's this bronze with the actual of the image of the child that died, 1882. Paintings of death scenes. Here we have the multi-generational, where we have the young mother, the young woman dying, the grieving husband in both sides, the mother probably on the left in both paintings, and then two children, because in the time of Victorian times, there was a family affair, and the children were included in illness, in death. Babies were born in the homes. They knew what was going on. Most of my ancestors grew up on farms. They were very well informed about some aspects of sexuality and reproduction. Didn't realize it didn't pop on all at once. It included all of even the children. I'll talk about that at the end. I've got to watch my clock. We have to be out of the building by 9.
Yes.
Well, that hardly leaves us any time at all. So these are some monuments where I found actual deathbed scenes put in. And we have a soldier on the left, Kensal Green in England. Here's a wall monument in the cathedral in England. And then at the bottom, again, you see the person who's dying. I don't know if I can make this thing work. Get it? Where'd it go? I don't have a laptop. Whoa, that's not what I wanted to do. Go back. Oh, there it is, there it is. Got it. Here is the angel, and the person who is dying is being taken up in that one. The primary concern of the Victorians was the death of the loved one. And if Billy Barry's in his whole theory about death attitudes calls this time death of the other, the death of the other era. And the family plot, or a vault, was the common way. And they wanted to keep the family together. Now my great-grandparents, who died in on mother's, father's side, it's confusing when you do this family stuff, doesn't it? Because it's sort of like roots that goes all over the place, and trying to explain which root you're talking about. I suppose branch is better. But he bought 8 plots in London in their big cemetery. That was fine. So there was my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather, and a great-aunt. Great-aunt? Yes, great-aunt. And my grandmother married the family, did not wish to spend the rest of her time with her sister-in-law. And so she refused to bury her husband, who predeceased her, in the family plot. So there's a plot for just the two of them in a separate section. Now, what happened to the other 5? I don't know. What? Because all the other children scattered, which is what has happened to so many families. But it's very interesting when we look at some of these enclosed family plots. You'll notice if I can get this little thingy to do it again. Is there a secret? Oh, there it is. See this reef knot? See that reef knot? I have my grandmother's friendship ring, which is a tiny little piece of gold and it has a reef knot and a lock and a key. Really, really delicate. And that was a sign of love and affection. Big, huge thing that we see with the Victorians. And if they didn't keep their family together in a fenced-in area, they would have a mausoleum. How many of you have seen some of the mausoleums in the old cemeteries that are built into the sides of hills? If you've been to Maitland Cemetery, you can't miss them because you have to drive past them to get up. The more famous one is the at Castle Howard in not far from York, and it was the family mausoleum upper right, where the Howards are buried. The one on the left, I believe, if I remember correctly, is Detroit. Lower right comes from one of the big 7 in London, England, and it's very ornate. And the one on the left, my son, who teaches a similar course at the University of Manitoba, he took that in Colorado. So, and many of the early mausoleums that we see in Calcutta are also huge and very ornate, and people have those. It's coming back as well. If you've been out to Victoria Memorial Gardens, I think it's Victoria Memorial, and you come in the drive and there's one on the left just when you get in and one on the right. And so family mausoleums are coming back. And the time when we first moved to Windsor, and we were driving up through the States to go and visit my family in Goderich, and my husband, up 75, and he said, "Oh my, is that ever a huge golf course?" And I just smiled sweetly to myself because we kept going on and on, got right to the end, and it was a cemetery. Well, if you drive past that same cemetery now, you're going to see statues and verticals. It's no longer hidden. And the people that sell cemetery plots tell me that 75% of the plots they're selling now are for vertical monuments. We are returning to celebrating and being quite Victorian in the way we deal with death present day. This is a big one at Mount Pleasant in Toronto. It's the family mausoleum of the Eaton family. It's gorgeous. It's huge. And it's very Greek in style. They were fascinated by the ancient world, by Egypt and Greece. In fact, I was just reading Visit Britain, a British magazine, and I can't remember which one I was reading recently, and they talked about the influence of Egyptology on the Victorians when they, in their public buildings, in their cemeteries, and in their mausoleums. And because it's your loved one who dies, then it brings on great sadness. And how do we know what's going on about people's attitudes towards death is how they memorialize the people that died. I used to tell my students at the university when I was teaching death and dying, I wonder what the people who come in 2,000 years come and land on our planet, and they go around and they look at the various cemeteries from the 20th century, think about who we are and what our society, our context, as Jim said so well, the context of who we are. And because in Aurora, Indiana, Mrs. Shuck died, and her husband bought 18 plots at the local cemetery, had a big digger come in and dig enough room and put in a vault large enough for her pink caddy. And her casket went on top of the pink caddy. Now, when they dig that up in 2,000 years, she's going to be pretty important, right? I mean, look, she's got this vehicle that's obviously going to take her to whatever belief system we have in the afterlife. And then they go to Arlington Cemetery, and they find this little stone that's probably broken in 1,000 pieces that says John F. Kennedy. Well, who's that? Something for you to think about. Whereas what I find really interesting is that in many of these cemeteries, the really, really famous families have their own mausoleums, like the Eatons and the Howards and the very wealthy folks. And the folks that we don't even know anymore have these absolutely gorgeous monuments. Here's this young woman with 2 small children grieving. Alabaster. And even the cherubs are sad. He's holding a hanky. I don't know if you can see it. There's that arrow. There it is. Yeah, he's got a hanky in his hand. That's Journey. Another one. Very sad. And even the adults cry, the adult angels on the tombs. And the swans are sad. Pierre Case in Paris. And this is the blue angel, very famous motif, and it was first created in Pierre Case. And what we find interesting is that they have what they call a blue angel, which is an exact reproduction of this style of monument in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and various other places, because, wow, I really like that, I want one like that. Of course, we never do that, do we? No. Yeah. Sure we do. We want the latest. We want the, oh, somebody else has. Love the little one at the top left, because here's the fellow that's died. Here lies the body of her husband, and she has 3 small children. And when we go down to the piano, sadness, also sleep there almost, because she's holding her hands. And then the lovely one on the right. The one on the right is 1912, so that would be, HEIRS says that the death of the other era went really up until First World War times. When First World War came along, all of the traditions and the rituals and the things that the Victorians did, when you had 1, 2, 3, 4 family members and people on the street or in your neighboring who were suddenly killed, you didn't have time, you didn't have energy to do the rituals, and they stopped quite dramatically. But in Victorian times, they used symbols to represent the different aspects of death. A mourning wreath would be hung on the door, black wreath. And it was a signal, we didn't have email and Facebook and Twitter to let folks know what was going on. You had to use other symbols to let folks know that a death had occurred and this was a house of mourning. There's another tradition. I remember doing some grief work years ago with a woman who came from the sort of the West Yorkshire area of England, and she was quite upset. Her mother had died in England, and she said nobody said anything. Nobody from her neighborhood, and she'd lived there for a number of years, came and acknowledged that she'd had a death. And I said, how, talk about that. And she said, well, I pulled all the shades and kept them closed. But you see, we wouldn't understand that tradition. So she was quite upset about that, and well, the people across the street did, but other than that, she felt quite isolated. She insisted that her husband wear a black armband to work, which she did for a week. Whether he left the house with it on, if he kept it on when he got to work, I don't know. He was Canadian. But that's how some of the traditions hang on, particularly in the more isolated areas. The broken column of life is another symbol that death has occurred, and we see that in the monuments. Another couple of symbols are the doused torches of life. You turn a candle upside down, it quickly goes out. And there's a mourning wreath. Pomegranates, I'm not quite sure what that's all about. And the pointing to heaven. Huge when we look at some of the pictures of the angels that come along. And quite often on the early monuments, and I'm thinking before 1860, there may often be a quotation from biblical material or a verse of poetry. What the Victorians really wanted, because it was the death of their loved one, they wanted to understand that they would be together again in the afterlife. And if you know anything about high society in Victorian times, they did not do bare hand to bare hand. That was a very sexual thing. So they wore gloves. The ladies wore gloves. I can remember wearing white gloves. How many people had to wear white gloves? Okay. So I'm not alone. And that's a hangover where we wore white gloves. We wore them to church. We wore them wherever we were going, even in the summer when it was hot and our hands got sweaty, but we still wore them. So here we have this symbol of the male and female hand. We can tell by the cuffs. That one, there's a ruffle on the one side and shirt and coat on the other, so that it symbolized that they would be joined forever in eternal life. One of the other things that is a hangover from medieval times is the symbol of the Book of Life, the Liber Vitae. And the Victorians picked up on this, and they had some angels actually writing in the Book of Life, or just reading the Book of Life. The Book of Life in many of the Victorian monuments came as a scroll. We saw that in one of the first slides, where they would have the name of the person that died. And I think I talked about Greek and Egyptian times. So we have a lot of pyramids showing sphinxes, the Grecian urn covered with a shroud, the broken column again. The lower right comes from Highgate Cemetery. If you really are fascinated by this kind of thing and you get to London, England, they will give you a tour of Highgate Cemetery. And I had my tour, and my husband is, he's learned very quickly that when the volunteer comes to help us, show us the special things in the cathedral, and they get very upset when I want to look at the gory stuff. So my husband deflects them and takes them off And the first time we realized that, I was taking a picture of a brass of a skeleton that had been moved from the floor and put into the wall in Ely Cathedral. And I was all set to take a picture, and this elderly, now much older than myself at the time, I've now reached that age, but he came and he stood right in front of me and said, "You don't want to take that." And I think my husband sensed the steam starting to rise. And he said, "Oh, what should she be taking a picture of?" He said, "Oh, the Victorian carved pulpit." So off he took them, and I got wall paintings, and I got all kinds of stuff. So we learned over the years that he would deflect. So we went on this tour, and I would wander off and get a picture of this, and the guide would say, "You can't go there, come back, come back." And, so I wrote to them. I was going back to London, and I said, "I'd like to have a private tour because it was so fascinating, and I teach this aspect at the University of Windsor, and blah, blah, blah." Didn't get a response. So I phoned them when we got to London. "Oh, yes, I remember that letter. Well, we can't give you a private tour because how do we know you won't publish a book without our permission?" No, I'm going to do that. Or how do we know if one of your students is going to be a family member of the person who died and they will be upset? And I knew right then she didn't have any idea why they had these monuments. I mean, the Pharaoh put up a pyramid so we wouldn't forget them. Well, they put up a big monument so we wouldn't forget them. They didn't want to be forgotten. I don't know if I'll go back this spring or not, probably not. This one on the left is fascinating because it has the whole idea of the Egyptian, thank you, obelisk, with the urn on the top, the douse torch, the morning wreath, and the joined hands. They're covering all the bases. Getting all the symbols in. But the other thing that's interesting is that in the Victorian cemeteries and other monuments, even the trees are sad. And when they planted trees that wept. So you see weeping willows and weeping cedars and those, they acknowledged their sadness. Place of burial. Public cemeteries developed outside of the urban areas and were no longer connected to the churches. And in Victorian times they had two. Still had the churchyards, but then these big public cemeteries outside began to be developed. They called garden cemeteries. The Americans call them garden cemeteries. And they happen outside of where the people live in towns and cities, usually publicly owned, and they were planned to be beautiful, like Elysian fields. You see that theme, with graceful trees and winding paths, and hopefully if you have some bumps up and down and maybe a creek that goes through, it was to be a beautiful, graceful garden. But it also had to have easy access for visitation because people used to go to visit. For the Elder College, if I get to do it again, we're taking lunch. And we're going to do, when we go on our cemetery tour, and we will do the Victorian things and have lunch, because that's what they did. So the plans, this one was planned, Kensal Green was planned in London in early times, and 1833, and the Penny magazine published in 1834. Now I've photocopied this, my originals at home, and it is basically an article on this new cemetery that is being built and all the problems of having them near people and how much better this will be. So that these etchings and pictures are from, where did I put it? Do I pass it around or do I leave it and people can look later?
That's your choice.
Okay, pass it around, okay. I got lots of stuff to pass around. So there's the beautiful circle, and you can see the winding paths. What is interesting about this particular one, the road to London is on the bottom, and the canal is at the top. And when they put the railway in, shortly after, about 10 years later, it went parallel with the road to London. So anybody could visit either by water, road, or train. You were expected to go and visit your loved ones. And this is how they picture it. See the road from London on the right, the canal on the left, and the railways across the street when it came in. And you can get right there now. Of course, it's no longer out in the country. It's in London, in the city. But it's still being used, so it's a beautifully kept, and it makes a great trip if you're interested in that one. It's the first one in England, first garden cemetery in England, 1833, and it did not run out of money like Highgate. So it's beautifully kept. And these are two of the advertisements in the magazine, in the little article that's being passed around. Mausoleums built into the side of a hill, and then the colonnade over the catacombs at Kensal Green. Each of these magnificent 7 Victorian cemeteries in London had catacombs underground where people could be buried. And they're just beginning to take a look at some of these. Didn't look at them at all for the last 2-3 quarters of the 20th century. Here is a picture of the nonconformist chapel as they imaged it would be, and the people coming into Kensal Green. I have etching of that one hanging in my office. And this is how they imagined the Church of England chapel would be. If you look in the right-hand side, sort of the one on the left, you'll see how they thought that might look. I didn't see any evidence of that chapel left at Kensal Green, but this is how they advertised, because they were in business. Right? We know all about advertisement. This is the main avenue of Kensal Green, and these monuments are huge and they're beautiful. The one in the upper right is a woman's, her sarcophagus, whether she's really buried in the sarcophagus or found in the vault, I'm not sure, but 4 angels from the 4 corners, all pointing to heaven. The lower left has green marble and red marble, and this gentleman was one of the high officers of the East Indian Company, so he made a lot of money in the East, and when he died, he got a very ornate monument. The gentleman on the right was an artist. If you can see the palette, the painting palette in the lower center, and he was the inventor of the postal envelope when they stopped using wax and seal to send mail. It's really quite amazing, that cemetery. This is the Glasgow Acropolis, if you ever get to Glasgow. The cathedral's just over here on the left. You walk over the river and it's on a hill, and it still looks very, very much like this, so that we get this at the top. We were there on a very gloomy day, and it got darker and darker, and my husband took off in one direction and I went in the other. A little bit scary. But here we have these individual monuments into the side of the hill. Nunhead Cemetery in London. My soon-to-be 92-year-old cousin, who was born and raised in London, didn't even know it existed. It's on the South Bank, and they've only recently created a Friends of Nunhead Society who are trying to preserve some of the monuments. And the gates are gorgeous, douse torches, walk in the front gate, and there's the Church of England chapel. The nonconformist is just inside on the left, being non-Anglican. And there are the gates, beautifully preserved. However, all that's left of the chapel now is the front arch. And it's a jungle. And animals and people live in the 50 acres. Brompton. Brompton Cemetery is still being used. We actually witnessed a funeral at Brompton when we were there. And it's, again, no longer out in the, it's right in the city, and comes between two main roads so that people use that walkway to get from one side to the other quickly or by bicycle. And it's very beautiful. It's not nearly as interesting as some of the others because it has no hills. But that avenue of trees, you can see in the first diagram, they're little sticks, right? Well, now there are these big, beautiful trees that have grown for 150 years. That's the gate at the far side. Lucky enough, I found a copy of that etching for my wall. And this is the gate at the front side, as it is today. And I have never seen anywhere else such a large collection of Victorian angel monuments. It's absolutely gigantic. It's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. In all states of kneeling, of praying, of various states of angels. And, of course, try again for that pointer. Here, in the upper corner, is this. And under, you can see if you go down the steps, and that's where you get into the catacombs, so that you can get a family plot in the catacombs, like a vault, like we would have a mausoleum which is above ground, which is very Mediterranean, but it's not uncommon in Northern Europe to see underground catacombs with iron gates. Can't get in there. It's double padlocked and a heavy chain. And there is a picture of the walkway, which is open, and then the catacombs underneath, and Brompton Chapels at the end, where the funeral that we saw, a child's funeral, we saw the family and the hearse go down, and then we saw them walk back in the tradition with the undertaker first, the mother and the father, the other grieving people, and then the hearse with the casket and the other grievers behind. Highgate Cemetery in England is sort of the high note, and they have two. They have the east and the west. The east cemetery, Karl Marx is buried in, and it is open. The west cemetery is the older one, the more Victorian one. That's where you have to reserve a spot for your tour. 2 o'clock in the afternoon weekdays. And then I think they have them more frequently on weekends. And what they did was they wanted to be able to have a view. And there was a cedar of Lebanon growing on this hill. So they decided to dig out around the cedar of Lebanon and put monuments into both sides of where they channel that they dug out. And they had a walkway that you could walk, stairs you could go down. That's the stairs you can go down. Or Egyptian path to go up, where you could walk up. Stairs down or walk up on either side, on their right and left. And then around the mausoleums. And of course, they didn't want me to go in there. I got squawked at because they were doing some construction, and so I wasn't allowed to go in there. That was the best picture I could get. But I've seen some on the internet since, and all those dark monuments have been cleaned, and they're bright, bright white. I'll show you some pictures, hopefully. There's the difference in the upper right of a restored one for the Friends of Highgate and the one that has been just left, because they ran out of money about 75 years ago. And that meant perpetual care was gone. So you see trees growing up out of tombs and ivy all over. Everything's gone back to being a jungle. And here we have some monuments on, built into mausoleums into the side of a hill. Didn't get to see the piano, but it is in Highgate. Again, probably in one of the spots that's rather dangerous, because it's been in such disrepair, they can't just let you wander around. You might get hurt. You might fall into one of these. That would not be fun. Laurel Hill is from Philadelphia, and it's built in the same way, just the way the one Mount Pleasant is in Toronto. It's that same idea. So you have the advertisement in the upper left, the design on the upper right, and then an aerial picture of what it looks like today. Still very much maintaining that aspect. So if you're going to one of these bigger cities, and you get a chance, have a wander, have a look. They really wanted to make sure that the souls would be reunited in nature and prolong earthly affection for all eternity. And so what they wanted to do was to keep the memory of the loved one alive. And they did that through their monuments by putting the names in. And here we have 1904, 1874, and another one that's so bright I can't read it. But there was an iron gate around this. And it was built on a very steep hill, so we kind of went down sideways to see this one. Clasped hands above. And sadness, angel pointing to heaven, and then a profile of the face of the man that died. And that one is 1791, so just before the Victorian times. Wealthy, and it's a wall monument in a cathedral. 1891 and 1850, died 7th of December 18, I'm guessing when I say 58. And that would have been added afterwards. And a sad angel. And you see the scroll, the book of life. It's who we are. Don't forget me. Crosses were huge, but they were usually ornamented with mourning wreaths, or ivy, or lilies, lilies being a sign of purity, and they would use that as a symbol. And they used angels, praying angels. There's that collection of angels again. Angels pointing to heaven, angels holding mourning wreaths, angels praying, the doused torch and pointing to heaven on the one. Angels were huge. And angels at first were like the one in the upper left. They were asexual and they were stationary. And as we move, and when I did my research, I looked at the imaging of angels and how they moved along down the century. Then they began to move. Now, if you remember Victorian times, the women wore, remember Gone with the Wind, and she had this thing that went out, and you didn't show your ankles. My grandmother dressed and undressed in the closet. She was born in 1874, and she did. And so, but you could talk about death, you couldn't talk about sex. So here we have this angel who's moving, and you can see the shape of the leg. So a little bit risque. And sometimes a little more shape of both legs. And these are done by progression through the century. This little cutie is in Mount Pleasant, and you'll notice her dress is falling off her shoulder. She's not wearing any undergarments. It's terrible. Didn't do that. And then, of course, the French. They were much more open. Another interesting, if you can't get to visit any of the cemeteries in London, which are easy to get to, Brompton's just right there on the tube line. The Victorian Albert Museum has a whole display of monuments, funereal monuments from over the years, and this was one that they have up on the wall. And again, she's busty, and she's got, you can see the shape of her leg, and I think her toes are showing. Beautiful pieces of work. I mean, they were just magnificent pieces of art. A lot of money. Yep, a lot of money to make. This one on the right is Charleston, South Carolina. Morning wreath. What fascinated me was when you walk into Kensal Green and you get past the first section where all the roads separate, and you look to your right, and there she is, breathing against the monument. Just my first sort of real experience with Victorian funereal arts, and it's just delightful. Now this lady, I've never seen that shape of a monument, and it's in the Catholic Cemetery in Detroit. We didn't get to see that. Next time we're going to go and see that, because there she is. I mean, Victorian ladies did not cross their legs. They didn't even cross their ankles. And here she is, like we do nowadays, right? The old leg goes over, and interesting. What was really interesting about Victorian times is that they moved from showing angels to showing angels that showed the body parts, and then the wings dropped. So that by the end of the 19th century, they were usually just images of women. And of course, the French. But she's gorgeous. She's absolutely gorgeous. But South Carolina, same time. A young girl, mind you, but South Carolina. Now, when you got an envelope like this in the mail, and your mail came twice a day, 6 times a week, you would know from the shape of the envelope that inside would be an in memoriam card. And this one, come on, MacKendrick. I don't think I might be these. Okay, this is 1899. And if any of you, how many of you have some of these delightful things in your family? Oh, hang on to them. I got them from my grandmother's trunk. It was great. And so that would be one way, and I'm going to pass, since the thing started over there. Where's that article disappeared? Okay, let's start this one here. Here are some examples, and they started from earlier to the end. And sometimes things would appear. It's a very simple one from my grandmother's trunk, and it's Margaret Galbraith, wife of Peter McIntyre, who died in her 46th year and in 1907. And it's just paper. You can see it's been damaged. So we'll just pass that to your left this time. Then my grandmother managed to save 3 others, and I bought one. I buy them when I can get them. I was in England and saw a whole basket full, and I thought, well, I shouldn't take them all because somebody will want them. It was England. They throw these things in the garbage. I went into mapping places to try to buy originals of the advertisements, and the people that owned it, oh, I throw those out, nobody will want to publish. So there would be a hard card with the information. And that would be mailed out. This one is German background. And if you were really wealthy, or you really wanted to make sure nobody forgot your loved one, got it here. We have Mrs. Margaret Irwin, who my grandmother used to go and have tea with. She died in 1896, and they have a photograph of her. So we're not going to forget who she was. So that was awesome. And the other thing that they did, here's one that's a little bit later, 1886. This fellow fell asleep in England, and they have a photograph of him. And I was very fortunate. I've hooked up with a early map person in a little stall in London, England, and I found the memorial card for Prince Albert. So, what we have here on the left is the Westminster Abbey, the special service for Queen Victoria, or a funeral notice about Elder Osborne, 1883. Well, it's really interesting. I found this on the internet, the Canadian Gazette, and it was a report about Queen Victoria's death. You see the black borders on this whole page? They had been used to being invited cemeteries, but as time went on and postal services got better, long before radio, and long before putting things in newspapers, although they did, obviously, things were sent in the mail because you had service on a regular basis. Sometimes I think their physical communication was much better than what we're experiencing with the cutbacks in our own postal services around the world. It's not just us. Because children died so frequently, there were special coffins, and we still have special caskets in North America, in our own funeral homes here in Windsor, for children of various sizes. But the color in those days was white. And you see that there's a photograph there of a body of a young child in its casket. The shape of the early coffins in North America are that shape. Okay, they were on the British European style, wider in the shoulders and narrower. We've moved to a straight casket, square type now. How many of you have been to the Huron County Pioneer Museum? Oh, good. Did you get in to see the hearses? No? You did. Okay, well, you already know the story, so I'm not spoiled. I went to grade 1 in that building. A little bit of history, useless information. And if you go into where the hearses are, there are 2 hearses. There's a big black Victorian hearse for the adults, and a smaller white one for children. And there's summer ones and winter ones. And what does winter ones like? Sleighs. They're on sleds. And at least the last time I was at the museum, they had an example of each, which is just, that's our experience in which we live. Processions were solemn. Here's an infant that died in this family, and the 4, they look like little girls, are carrying it We have the weeping mother, the father, grandparent probably coming behind. This is a painting. But part of the tradition, if we didn't have a sleigh, was to have what they called a coffin cart. The one in the upper would be pushed and pulled by human beings, and the one on the bottom was heavier and could be pulled by a horse. These are I found in local churches and small villages. So again, it would be like our farming communities in Victorian times in Essex and in our area. Now, my mother talked about the fact that when they put the new Highway 2 through near Bothwell, they put the new highway right over her great-grandparents' graves. Would never get away with that nowadays, would we? We have returned to using ancient Victorian hearses. Windsor Grove, here. And lower left, South Carolina. Lower right, Highgate Cemetery in England. It is something people are doing today because we've returned to that elaborate outpouring of emotion, which was hidden for so long. Victorian funeral processions were very elaborate, very black. The horses were black, they were draped with black cloths, they had big plumes of black feathers. The hearse had, that particular one has 8 sets of huge black feathers, and they'd be dyed black, but they would be black. And coming before the funeral procession, not like the police car we have, or the, where they have the light going, there would be these 2 men who would be waving a black covered stick. They would be all in black, and it was one of the only professions for the deaf mute, because they wouldn't be distracted by sounds. Anybody saying anything, and it was a very respected job for people who couldn't hear. But if it was a child's funeral, white. Black clothing with white ornaments. You see the difference in what he's carrying and the sash that he's wearing and the headdress. Here is etching from, and it's Lord Frederick Cavendish, and he died. And all the people are in formal mourning clothes, and the gentlemen have taken their hats off as the hearse is going by. Same year, there was a colliery accident in a coal mine, and a large number of coal miners were killed, and they come in carts, they still have a procession, the people are still gathering. You don't see the men doffing their hats, there's plaid, there's whatever the people had, because not everyone could afford to have mourning clothes. Queen Victoria's funeral procession. Now, I'm not sure that we're going to see the crown being paraded on top of a casket or a coffin anymore, but it's in that one. Graves were visited. Iron benches. This lovely one I found in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and a book of life on top of a stump, and a bench behind for visiting. The idea was to keep the loved one alive. Here's 2 young men that were both soldiers and were both killed at a young age. So we have their profiles and we have their stories on the right. And on the left, this young woman who's carrying a baby. She died at sea and was buried at sea. And when her husband came home from being in the East Indies, he had this memorial monument put in Gloucester Cathedral. elaborate monuments, huge, gigantic, usually in a wall, and the people would be buried under the stones of the big churches. This one is a bishop's, and we have the angels covering him with a shroud. It's beautiful alabaster, but the 4 little plaques show him preaching, confirming, standing in the House of Lords, and receiving alms for the poor on the left. So it tells the whole story of who he was as a bishop. And then, of course, around the bottom is his actual who he is and the information. Memento Mori, and I passed around some of those notices, and that was to keep something incorruptible fragment of the loved one alive. So you have a program from the memorial program from Queen Victoria's service. You have actual pictures of cards, and then this one on the right, this man was a potter for Wedgwood, and he had done one for his child when she was, I think, just had a birthday, and then she died quite suddenly a few months later, and he did one as she was dead. It's an amazing piece of art when it's clay, when you think of it as clay. But they took pictures of the dead. Rather pricey if you're trying to find one. And they had them professionally done. Lower left is a Mexican. Some were daguerreotyped. The upper 2 and the upper right are professionally taken by professional photographers. Others would simply have a photographer come in. The bottom middle, the baby has died and the 3 siblings are being pictured with that person. In my own family, my grandmother was one of 8, 4 boys and 4 girls. She was the youngest girl, and all of these, she was the only surviving female child. One died at 3, one died at 12, and one died, her older sister, next sister, Bessie, died of ruptured appendix at 17, so she was quite cosseted, as they would say, because she was the surviving child. And they would take pictures of them in the coffin, and quite often in our part of the world, pictures would be taken and then sent to the families at home, and vice versa. The one in the upper left, the one in the lower right was a family one that was given to me by a student, and it was an Italian family that had been passed down in her family. And that would be keeping an intangible part of the loved one on. And memorial cards, of course. Those are some fancy ones. I passed around examples of others. We still do that, don't we? Prayer cards at funeral homes. The other thing that they did, though, was they kept mourning jewelry. And I don't think there's any epiphelias on this particular brooch, but these are 2 locks of my great-aunt Bessie's hair that my great-grandmother wore. She wore it so much, she broke the glass, and the clasp is gone. Now, my grandmother was 11 when her sister Bessie died, and the hair is hidden behind in here. She was blonde. And I'm going to just pass these around, and trust you don't. I didn't let my students from the university pass it around. They had to come up and see them at the end of class. Mourning pins to pin your veil. My grandmother's necklace, which has managed to lose its clasp over the years of me showing it, which was obviously a little girl's when they had dark jewelry. The men had tie tacks for the back of their collars, collar tacks. And the men would have short pins where they could pin a rosette. Women had long, there's a couple of very long hat pins with the black tops. And if you get a chance to look at this one, I got this one in Devonshire Mall when they used to have antique shows. And it's that typical black, but inside is the photograph and hair. Never seen one quite like that. The hand holding the wreath, a couple of examples of that, and that was in the Victorian Albert display when they did their memorial morning glory a number of years ago. There's rings, there's pins, there's to my mother, to my father, and are you feeling left out over there? Well, we'll start. Have a look, just pass it around. Bottom right. In memory, yes. And pictures upside down, very good, thank you. Nobody's ever mentioned that before. You got good eyes. I think maybe they were all asleep by the end of this time. But you can see that they have various aspects. Some of them are inscribed. My oldest one that I have is just a plain gold band with black enamel, and it says in memory, but it's been so used that I can't read the inscription anymore. But the dealer I bought it from said he thought it was probably about 200 years old, because they usually gave those out to the pallbearers when they were that much older, that old. A couple of them are inscribed with the name. But mourning customs that they viewed the body at home. How many of you have had the experience of viewing a body in your home? Irish background? Pioneer? No, just the tradition. I can remember when I was a hospital chaplain, we had there was an Irish woman who'd come from Ireland to see the person who was dying, and the person died, relative, and she said, oh, we have to have the viewing at home. We always have the viewing at home. And I'm thinking, okay, which funeral home's going to work this? There is one in town that will work this. It's not a problem. But when I said, have you thought about visitation? And the daughter, rather than the niece from Ireland, said, well, I know in Ireland we do this, but we're not doing that. It'll be in the funeral home. I thought, phew, it made my life a lot easier. So when we talk in terms of the pioneer homes that we see, is that they would have a front parlor, right? They didn't live in the front parlor. That's where you visited with the priest, or you might have Sunday evening prayers. That was also where you viewed the bodies. And they lived in the big open kind of kitchen with the stove and that type of thing. But they usually had a room that was the front parlor. This one's called The Last Look, this beautiful etching. It's about this big, hangs in my office at home. And it's the last look of the widow and her children and the mother back in the far left-hand side before they close the coffin. The last look. And of course, the lovely little boy is too busy looking out at the birds or wherever he wants to go. Good for him. Clothes were important. Victoria's did the setting. Middle, there she is with her children in deep mourning clothes. But on the left-hand side, that's an advertisement from a fashion magazine. And the North Americans got all their fashions from magazines coming out of Paris. And they would show a picture to their seamstress, who would come to the house on a regular basis, and she would look at the picture and make what you wanted. But you really needed to know what kind of clothing you should have. And so here are instructions that were published in, oh golly, I forgot to write it down, 1870 something, about the kind of fabric you would use and the colors that you would use and whether the niece wore this or the child wore that. Very elaborate mourning customs. It's American, but basically they all followed along. So you have these wonderful fans and umbrellas and headdresses and, Oh my goodness, she's wearing a fascinator. Things rotate, don't they, style. I have a friend who had a whole bunch of clothes made, and it looks straight out of my youth in the early 60s and early 70s style. And paintings of the widows in their widows' veils and weeds. So upset she wants to throw herself into the grave with the husband or the child, whoever it is. But you know, when you have all this stuff, you have jewelry, and you have clothing, and you have announcements. You have to advertise, you have to buy them, right? So here are advertisements on how and where to get the things that you need. Because commercialism is alive and well. Here's furnishing undertakers and monumental £1.10. Could we ever get anything for £1.10? I think it's for the funeral of Frederick Robertson, child's white covered coffin and chair of furniture. Amazing. When I went through my grandmother's trunk, I found her scrapbook that she had kept as a child of 12. And if you think scrapbooking and that kind of thing, and the whole thing, page after page of this falling apart envelope looked like this. And it had recipes and poetry and interesting information, except for one page. And it's the scrapbooking type. She's carefully cut out flowers from cards, and in it is a memorial for Bessie, her sister. In memoriam of Bessie Cowan, who died July 1884. My grandmother would have been just 10 years old at the time, and this went in when she was 11. So when she was 11, she did this. And this is normal, this is grieving. Her last sister. Interesting. Questions? Because I'm yammered, because I have this hammer hanging over my head. Yes?
A lot of different civilizations have a lot of obviously different attitudes and you need monuments for graves, but the Romans in particular, used to bury monuments along the via ways, and it's often a competition to beat each other.
Absolutely.
And if you narrow roads when they've got clutter on both sides sometimes. I was wondering the aspect of burying people alive that they thought were dead, and he used to put the bell in the coffin, and the gravedigger's one of his responsibilities was to, if he wasn't a drunkard, to listen for bells and
I didn't bring that picture. I have a picture. Well, I know there's a reason for it, but they used to also in their wills, put in the will, be sure to cut the inside of the foot with a scalpel to make sure that, because if anything is going to make you jump, it's that part of your body if your feet are at all ticklish. Well, if you cut that bit and you're not dead. And there were instances where people were alive.
There was one in the paper last week where in the States that he was in a body bag and he was supposed to be unzipped and formaldehyde and he picked the bag and
Well, I had an incident when I was a hospital chaplain of showing an elderly person who had died, and the family had come in, and I went back to always, so I prepare the family for what they would see and what they would smell and what they would hear, and before they came in to see the body, and I said to the nurse, I think you better come back here because Mrs. So-and-so is not dead yet.
I got an email today saying so-and-so had passed away, and then I got another one saying, no, she hasn't.
Well, and that may be that just somebody was missing reformed, we don't have very many instances anymore, because in the late Victorian times, the doctors became the experts in declaring death. And it's only in the last 20-some years that nurses and paramedics have been given permission to legally pronounce death, at least in Ontario.
Yes.
You had said, I think I heard you say that you didn't know what the pomegranate stood for.
Yeah, but
The pomegranate was the fruit that Hades gave to Persephone to make sure that she came back
Excellent.
to the death, to
Thank you.
death.
Great, wonderful. See, I always learn something new, all the time. My field is very young as a thanatologist, it's only 40 years old yet.
I've read here and there, seen an example, I seem to recall, where somebody has died and they're propped up for a picture and their eyes are painted red.
Well, you wouldn't want them to look dead.
Is that a Victorian custom or?
Not always, but sometimes the eyes, and they weren't really good at keeping the eyes closed. Very difficult to get an elderly person in particular to keep the eyes closed on a dead person. Funeral directors have ways of doing it.
Can I just interrupt for a moment? Will?
I know, I'm looking
It's
at
okay, I just want to close the formal
Oh,
part,
formal,
because we're
all
starting
right.
to go to questions, and that's the informal part, you can do that, no problem. On behalf of the Essex County branch of the Ontario Genealogical Society, Catherine, I'd like to thank you so much for bringing to us an unusual but most interesting topic that will, as I say, provide the context for any research we do in the